Well, as you can see, there are 3 names up here, and I'm only one of those names, and I'm the one at the bottom, which I think ranks by compensation. And, but actually, so Court and Joe and I developed this training together, and we presented it. This is the 2nd year. And so what I'd like to say at the outset is this is one of those kind of worst case scenarios training. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of very unpleasant stuff, and I'm going to be telling you not to do a lot of unpleasant things, and I want to be very clear at the beginning that I don't think any of you are going to do any of those unpleasant things, but I have to say, please don't do them. And so this is a bit of a bummer training because we're talking about things that are, that make kids less than safe. But the goal here is to think critically about where we get into gray areas that might result in getting past more sharp lines. So please don't feel condescended to, or please don't think that I think that you're terrible people, because I really don't. This is completely generic, and I think you're all awesome. And so, because Court and Joe helped develop this, we start with disclaimers, which is that I'm not your lawyer, except to the extent that if you were a teacher in Minneapolis, I could sometime be your lawyer, but usually your lawyer would be a lady named Deb Poorhouse, who is much nicer than me. And this also was one that we provided training for the NFL. So this law, I mean, we're talking about the Minnesota laws, and they do pertain to you. And if you do have a problem, you should talk to an attorney if it relates to your employment, and if that means me, then, or Deb Courthouse, you should let me know if you're a teacher again in Minneapolis or St. Paul. Because if you're a teacher in St. Paul, I probably would actually be your lawyer. And then you should be familiar, and I'm going to say this again throughout the training more than once, know about your district's policies. And some are more important to this training than others, but of course all are very important. You should read every single one, and I know everybody always does. That's like a back-to-school ritual, right? It's going right through that policies and procedures handbook. All right, so we're going to talk about boundary issues, and boundary issues are really at the very heart of pretty much everything I'm going to say is something bad that happens in this activity. And that's the boundary between us as teaching professionals, coaches, and our students who are kids and under our care. And I think last time I did this training, I was saltier, but fortunately the recording didn't work, so I'm going to be less salty this time. But I will say that I am a very ageist person. I do not subscribe to any norms that there should be anything other than prompt and clear divisions in terms of ages, and those follow those legal limits. So I don't care about any of the French malarkey, to the contrary. And so that means that we're in charge of making sure that the kids are, they're subject to our discipline, both discipline in terms of the practice of doing what you're doing, and also discipline as in punishment if you're not doing something that you're supposed to be doing. And then we have to be clear that we treat everybody equally, and that our relationship is, again, purely a professional one. So some of these are easy, right? And this is coach-student boundaries. If you're a teacher, you've probably heard this before as well. Touching is really not required and never recommended, except under pretty extraordinary circumstances, like the student's leaning out a window and you need to grab them by the collar to drag them back. And I hate to be that person, but we're kind of past the point where you can hug with impunity. So just generally speaking, no touching unless you're actually rescuing somebody from something. And then interactions outside of tournaments should be controlled, planned, and probably with support. And so, thinking about who is going to be there, who is going to be with you at this practice or the session that you're having, where is it going to take place? At your house, I would recommend not. Like, kids should not pass your threshold unless it's in throngs of like 10 or 15 at a time. Methods of transportation, my recommendation is that students get to wherever they're going under their own power. And that you not drive kids around. And that there's a real practical consideration to that, as well as kind of the general boundary issue, which is that the more you drive the kids, well, really any time in which you're driving kids around for a school activity, your vehicle is practically speaking now subject to state regulation in a way that it wasn't. It becomes what's called a Type 3 vehicle. And that means that that means you have to be doing pre-trip inspections, and in many ways you have to treat your car like a bus. And so it's a big pain in the neck, and for the districts, it's probably not what they prefer anyway. And then the activities at the event, obviously, there are team morale building activities, and if everybody's there and you're all watching The Princess Bride, which is what nerds did in my day, then that's fine. But if the activities of the event are you and the coach watching a movie, that is not okay. And then the timing and frequency, and the more often that we're interacting with students on an individual basis outside the confines of a practice or tournament situation, the more concern I have that there's an erosion of that boundary. Obviously, this is a hard and fast line. I mean, students are off limits for sexual and romantic relationships, and within the confines of the UDL, that does not matter if the student's 18 or older. There are old kids. I was an old kid. I could vote when I was a senior. I voted for Ross Perot, so, and that's something I probably wish wasn't on video. I think Clinton was going to win. And so, but really, it's important to know that that age doesn't matter, because it's still, the boundary issue remains. And to be honest, for teachers, it would not matter for the purposes of the Board of Teaching as well. I mean, where licensure is impacted, they don't care if you're committing a violation of the law. You still may be violating teacher ethics codes. And so, knowing both of those things, it's never going to be permissible. Obviously, if the student's underage, then other legal implications arise, and that includes statutory rape, and any other coach-student relationship that isn't rising to that level is still potentially leading you to criminal liability. And honestly, during the school year, I take more of those calls than I wish that I had to, which is to say, I wish I had to take 0 of those calls. We have a lot of teachers in the state, and the vast, thronging majority of them are totally awesome and don't have any problems. But you'd love to hear that there's absolutely no problems, and that's just not true. So keep in mind that this gives rise to a lot of legal liability as well as you getting fired. So during season, off season at camps, it's just never permissible. And the thing I think for teachers to keep in mind is that if a student were to graduate and you were to commence a relationship with them shortly thereafter, such as the summer after they graduate or even in the year after they graduate, the Board of Teaching will probably infer that you were grooming or starting to foment that relationship during the school year, and they probably still will suspend your license. So just something to keep in mind. And then alcohol, drug use, and cigarettes. With the exception of cigarettes for the kids who are 18, obviously all of that is prohibited, and it's prohibited as a matter of employment, the employment relationship with the UDL as well. You should never be drinking in the presence of students, and you should never be providing cigarettes to students. And obviously, if we bust our kids smoking, they're violating MSHSL rules, and that's a problem too. So, yes.
Just like as a smoker, as long as I keep it off campus and don't let any kids see that every week, it's fine.
Now you know that that's going to kill you, right?
Oh.
It's going to shorten your life.
I know.
Okay. Just want to make sure that you understand that.
This is not the first time here.
I like to reinforce where I can. Yeah, and often schools have broad prohibitions on what smoking can take place on their grounds anyway. So I would say not only take it off campus, but take it far off campus and not be visible. But you're going to smell like smoke. I mean, you're still not setting the world's greatest example if you're coming in and you're smelling like cigarettes. So I would say not during the tournament, but certainly not within the view of the students. And if you observe kids smoking, you got to deal with it. That violates MSHSL rules, and it may be violating laws, and you're going to have to likely report that conduct to your principal, because it's a bad idea as well. Oh, and then don't show up to a tournament drunk, right? So if you were at a party the night before and you're still not ready for prime time, you need to not show up under the influence. And I wish I could say that this is something I'd never ever heard of, that this is all a product of my fertile imagination, but it's not. So be professional. Okay, so the boundaries issue isn't just where you are and when you are there, but it's also the sorts of things that you talk about, because you could be in a perfectly professional setting, you could be at practice, and you can still have boundary issues. And again, our teachers know that your personal life should be brought into the classroom fairly sparingly, and certainly, on issues that could be even remotely controversial, probably not at all. So things like sexual issues and drug and alcohol issues, personal issues, should not be brought into your practice spaces. Now, we've got a privacy topic, and there are things that, not on this, probably on surveillance topic, but things like drug testing and other issues that are perfectly appropriate academic topics, but you should not be talking about your recreational or medicinal drug use, and you should not be talking about your sexual peccadillos or exploration or whatever. You just leave it at the door. And then overnight travel is also one where, you know, the lines that we have, I'm not gonna lie, are fairly heteronormative and fairly 90s, but I mean, students share rooms by gender, and if you can't match up a student, you don't share a room with that student. You try to work with another school to find a room for that student. So we just make sure that we're never ever sharing rooms. And then the coaches' parties are, I don't think as much a thing in state. They are sometimes a thing out of state when there's a tournament hotel and everybody wants to gather and blow off steam. And certainly if you are the only adult on the trip, you can't. I mean, you should probably, I mean, it may be one thing to go to the party, although I would say probably not, because to the extent that you're there supervising the kids, if you're unavailable or inaccessible, it's not a good choice. But even if they're there as a group of adults, it's still not permissible to go and get wasted at the coach's party. And then interacting on social media, and this is the area where I find I frankly get the most business, and the thing that keeps me employed as a lawyer for teachers is interactions on social media. And it's so important to know that you know, Facebook is a boundary reducer. It erodes those boundaries, and that is why it's really important to keep in mind when you're interacting with that student, even though your adult friends are on Facebook, a kid is still a kid, they're still a student, and they're not an adult friend. And so it's probably not a great idea to be Facebook chatting with a student that's not a group chat. And it's probably, it is a bad idea to be, you know, messaging singularly with some student in the middle of the night. In the middle of the night, you should not be thinking about your students. You should be, like, sleeping or doing work. But you shouldn't be thinking about one particular student, and you shouldn't be doing it all the time. And just as a matter of, I mean, what happens when these things go off the rails is that a parent will find these reams and reams of chats, and they will say, what on earth is going on between this coach and my child? And they will turn all that information over to the principal, to the superintendent, to the board of teaching, and then they will thumb through these reams of chats, probably the vast majority of which is innocuous, but the sheer volume is going to cause alarm bells to go off in everybody's heads. So keep in mind, these things are a potential pitfall, and in my view, not the best coaching delivery system. And I understand that that's really 90s too, and that's just where I am at. Okay, mandated reporting. So you guys are definitely mandated reporters. You will be overseeing students, you will be responsible for their care, and you know, both at tournaments, at practice, you are an adult in their life who's responsible for reporting any potential abuse or neglect that you see. So the law is very broad about the individuals who are subject to the mandated reporting obligation. And what you are supposed to report is neglect or abuse. The definition of abuse in the statute is actually quite voluminous and quite long. This is the nutshell, but physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, or threats of any type of abuse are all things that you should be, if you're aware of, you need to be reporting. Now, I can tell you that in my job, we spend a lot of time talking about what a serious physical injury looks like or what a threatened injury looks like. But ultimately, you need to be practical and kind of use your head. I mean, it's my job to waste a lot of time talking about transient redness or an honest-to-God bruise. But ultimately, if the child is reporting an injury or you perceive one, that triggers your obligation. And you don't need to have seen the abuse. You only need to hear about it, and you could hear about it secondhand. But you know that the law does not limit the scope to you being a first-person witness. In Minnesota, you have to make the report right away. You have to make the first oral report within 24 hours, and you have to follow up with a written report within 72 hours. And those are things that help the agency to whom you're making the report obviously follow up on and know with specificity what's happening. Some schools have a form, and so it's not a bad idea to you know, connect with your principal about if they have a particular form. And some agencies do, and they'll let you know what's appropriate. This part is, I think, the key part and really very, very, very important for everybody to know. Your obligation to make a mandated report doesn't end with your principal. In fact, your principal is not the person to whom you make a mandated report, or the superintendent, or any level of administration of the school. You need to be making that report to law enforcement or a local child welfare agency. And now, Now, I don't think it's a bad idea to talk to your principal, and I don't think it's a bad idea to talk to either the school counselor or the school social worker to say this is what's happening, you know, I should confer with you to get a better understanding of how best to handle the situation, but that does not satisfy your duty to report, and yes.
Okay, so I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
And so I get occasionally essays of people saying that they've been abused kind of thing. And so then I go talk to the counselor, and it's reported back to me that yes, police are involved, yes, parents are knowledgeable that this is happening, blah, 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 blah. Am I still liable if I don't actually say to another police officer?
I think that to be on the safe side, over-reporting is the way to go. I think it does seem duplicitous, and it does seem like if it's already being handled and the social worker is probably in the best position to know, you shouldn't have to make another report. But it's a misdemeanor not to do it. So I don't think that it hurts you to call the cops and say, this is what I heard, and then they say, oh, we're totally on it, don't worry.
Yeah, but there's, and I see what you're saying, but there's also the argument of, is it going to add more grief to an already grief-stricken situation, in the sense of the cops are going to come again to the door, the child and the parents are going to have to talk again to a different set of cops. Yeah.
Well, it might, but the law favors reporting over not reporting, and the law does not, and there's no gray area around, I wish to not incur more grief. Hopefully you talk to the right people and they say, we'll include this in our report. They don't have an interest in traumatizing or re-traumatizing a student, but they do have to conduct an investigation. And for you, I would say the policy of the state, the policy of the statute, of the legislature is we want to have the report.
Hey, Meg.
Yes.
So just want to refer you to your handout, the one that you get to keep. It has the phone numbers that for both Hennepin and Ramsey County. So one, for our community coaches, you will sign and give this back to me that you received the training, but one is also for you to take with you so that you have the phone numbers that you need.
And the last time I gave this training, there were questions about whether students bring personal narratives into the arguments that they make, into the discussions that they have around this topic or any topic. And I think you can, if you hear those discussions or the kids are developing that argument framework, it's still your obligation to make the report, even though it's happening kind of within the confines of the game. Really, the only circumstances under which that obligation wouldn't be triggered is if you knew without a doubt that this was made up, and that's almost never going to be the case unless you're very close with the student in some other way. So it is, I'm a better safe than sorry kind of gal, and to be honest, it's not, as something that gets prosecuted by county officials, it's not a heavily prosecuted one, but it was very recently in St. Paul in the last year and a half. There were actual prosecutions, and a principal lost her job, and other folks were in trouble, and it was because they declined to make reports that they absolutely should have made. So you just got to do it.
And Meg, another question before we leave mandatory reporting that was brought up last time was, if a student comes to you who's not your student, but a student from a different team, and is making an allegation, is that coach still a mandated reporter?
And that is a great question, partly because I answered the question wrong the first time. The answer is yes. And that is, the statute is extremely broad. It says if a child is subject to this, you have an obligation to make a report, or if you have knowledge a child is facing neglect or abuse. So it's not the kids you coach or the kids for whom you're responsible as a caretaker or anything limiting that. It is the most indefinite of indefinite articles. And so, I think that means pretty much any kid in the whole wide world. And so, for the most part, that world is going to be limited to the universe of kids that you teach and that you coach and who you see at tournaments. But they are all within that group. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about behavior that's happening between students that might trigger a mandated report?
I'm not as concerned about that because under the statute, actionable abuse, or mandatedly reportable. Abuse that's subject to a mandatory report is abuse by a caretaker for a child. So, but on the other hand, abuse that's happening between students is probably going to be subject to the bullying policy, and we'll get to that. That's going to be covered. Harassment. Harassment is in some ways the partner of and the flip side of the boundaries conversation. And harassment is, I'm going to be clear, this is Joe's slide. I mean, this is a long slide of reasons why harassment is bad. And I don't think I'm going to go through it in great detail, because I think you guys know that harassment is bad and why it's bad. But I'm going to hit the highlights, and that is that it hurts the kid, and ultimately it's going to hurt you if administration understands that you're not taking care of the situation, or you in fact are responsible for it. So the two types of harassment are, do this sexual favor for me, or some other ask, and you will be rewarded in some way in your debating practice. And the other type of harassment is just treating someone terrible and being hostile to them. And for me as an employment lawyer, harassment has a really particular context, and there's a lot of bad behavior that results because somebody is a female, or somebody is young, or somebody is gay, or somebody is African American, or of some other religion, and that violates the law. And sometimes there's harassment that takes place because someone's boss is a big fat jerk and is just mean. And what I've often said to people is, the law doesn't usually give you a bossectomy, and that the law does not make being a jerk illegal. For students, the law may not make it illegal, but the district absolutely will make it a problem for you. And so, harassment is a problem whether or not it violates a particular state or federal anti-discrimination law. I don't necessarily want to go bullet on quid pro quo harassment either. What I will say is that quid pro quo harassment is a type of harassment that can both exist and also be perceived. If it looks like a coach is grooming a student and a student is benefiting, by placement on the team or by getting more coaching, that's obviously a huge problem for both the student and the coach, as well as other team members. Whether or not it's really happening, if that perception exists, that's a big fat problem. And if it's actually happening, it's enormously problematic. So, I think some of the classic examples that you'll see is somebody not being placed on a team because they didn't submit to a particular sexual request, or that if somebody acts nicer or is more of a, I think there's a point at which it becomes very much a question of context. But if you've got a kid who's being told to be friendlier or nicer or more charming or more of a team player, and it doesn't relate to them producing evidence or participating in an activity that they haven't shown up for, you're probably going to have a problem. Especially because a lot of that stuff tends to be fairly gendered. So if it's a female student, you could have a big fat problem. And then hostile environment, if you're intimidating the students or you're acting like a tyrant, which is generally speaking not the most effective coaching mechanism anyway, you could have a real problem from the standpoint of the school district. Okay, bullying. So the bullying law changed in the last 2 years, and last time I did this training, Chris Stinson was here, and I'm so glad because he was extremely involved in working with the legislature to broaden and strengthen Minnesota's bullying law. And what that means for our kids is that there are a lot more teeth in the law, and that the definition of bullying is much more tied to what's actually happening to students in the school. What made it tough for the districts is that they had to develop new policies and they were required to do a bit more training. Now, some of the districts have been very forward-thinking and were doing that training prior to the imposition of the law because they knew it was coming. And to be honest, I did not think that law was ever going to be adopted because of the opposition from a number of the conservative groups on the other side. But districts, I was wrong and districts were right, which never, ever, ever happens except in bad ones. Otherwise, I'm always correct. I'm infallible, like people who oppose that law, if you know what I mean. So the statute on bullying, this is quite a robust definition of bullying. And it is, I think, much more sensitive to what the relationships are in school. It's an easy one when you're talking about staff-student. The power balance is clear, but imbalance of power between students may include size, it may include gender, it may include any number of factors that may make one student feel or really be more marginal than another. And so this definition captures the fact that leveraging that imbalance or making someone the target of repeated obnoxious behavior is going to constitute bullying. And I think this change to the statute really takes us out of the realm of boys will be boys. You know, this happens all the time. I went to Catholic school and I got beat by the nuns, so everything's, you know, this is way better than that. Like, this really amps up and helps our students in a great deal. And then it also ties it, of course, to the actual function of a school, and this means the function of your team as well. This is an educational enterprise, and we're really an extension of that. And so, you know, the behavior that makes it hard for a kid to function in school, that's bullying.
What is objectively offensive?
Yeah. Yes. It is, well, it is, I wouldn't say it's objectively, I mean, objectively offensive is a great phrase in statute. Nothing's really objectively offensive except for probably a handful of things. I'm sure my father-in-law could find a lot fewer things objectively offensive than I do, for example. But typically, I mean, that's going to capture your pushing, your physical intimidation, and it's also, I think, going to capture, you know, your ethnic slurs, your really terrible language. Oh, and then cyberbullying, not previously captured in the state law. Obviously, this updates our law to really reflect the oh, I'm so sorry, I'm embarrassed. That really captures the reality in which our kids operate now, that a lot of their life is lived online. And this covers text, it covers chat rooms, it covers Facebook, it covers GChat, it covers all that. It covers Facebook, GChat. I love it when I anticipate my own slide. So this, I think, this is where I return to my concern about school policies. The schools had to change their policies in response to this law, and hopefully most of them have, but there are a lot of school districts that probably, but I'm pretty sure St. Paul and Minneapolis, if they didn't already have compliant policies in place, did, and you know, many of the charters are pretty good on that. I assume the Minnesota Association of Charters has been on top of that as well. But they, you know, you have to have a policy that includes this definition and also provides avenues to report bullying. So there has to be a reporting system. Many districts didn't have that before. And then also cyberbullying. And so if you really don't look at anything else in your school's policies, please, for the love of God, look at this one. Because this one really does describe your responsibilities as an adult within the school district to report that. And they do exist, and there is a process, and you do have to initiate it. And if you don't, you'll be subject to discipline. And so, you know, hopefully districts have been doing training on these. I don't know what St. Paul and Minneapolis have been doing particularly. Yes, they have been.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of districts have things like the Obeas curriculum or other anti-bullying. You know, there's a lot of cottage industries that have sprung up around making money off training school employees not to, or to be able to police this bullying behavior. And I'm cynical about that because it's, you know, cottage industry stuff, but I'm also, you know, glad that the training is taking place. But as coaches, we might not get it specifically. So the best thing to do is to start with policy and then ask questions. If you have a question about behavior that's taking place, you know, this is different than the mandated reporting obligation. This is something you can volley off of a coworker or the principal and say, this is what I'm seeing, what do you think the best approach is? And your likelihood of being wrong is much lower if you talk to somebody else and bring them into the discussion. And it is so critical not to, there are some really perverse incentives for us as coaches, right? If we've got a student who's an absolute star performer, but who is really terrible to students on the team, you have an incentive to say, I'm going to try to handle this because I don't want to lose this kid. I don't want this kid to get benched because we value the student's performance. If it's policy, they have a partner. There's a lot riding on this. And I will say that as a former coach, I've seen that. That's happened on teams that I've been on. That, you know, we tried to handle it even when there was, at this point, it was actual cyberbullying. Should not have been kept in-house. Was appalling what happened. And it was a wrong call that I made. And I really want to encourage you guys to make the right call. Because it serves everybody better if this kid actually gets benched for 2 tournaments than if they act like a complete jerk for the rest of their life and they have no checks on them. And you might be, as their debate coach, one of the most important people in their lives, right? They love this activity. Nobody who's doing this doesn't love it. And it might be the most influential thing that you do. But it's also, you'll probably violate your school's policy if you don't do it. We're going to talk about transportation very briefly, knowing that this was, of course, part of the presentation when we did it. And I mean, the transportation issues, in some ways, they do dovetail, in my view, the boundaries issues, but there are some real nuts and bolts stuff to keep in mind. You know, the district has, obviously, its own transportation policies. There are clear policies around when you can take a kid, and really a lot of that's going to revolve around parent permission or guardian permission. I will not tell an unflattering story about anybody I know who was an assistant coach who maybe got a lot of speeding tickets and then was ineligible to drive. But that individual was a very successful coach in other areas, so we try not to hold it against him. But if you're a head coach, your assistant coaches need to be able to drive, and you can't just assume that they've got a live license, because even very successful, let's say, attorneys in the community sometimes get a lot of speeding tickets, and then they take your license away for a little while. And so everybody has to have that license, and your district is in a world of hurt if somebody's driving and they're not properly licensed. And they have to have appropriate insurance coverage, even if it's expensive, because I kept getting speeding tickets earlier in the day. And sometimes the districts have terms of insurance, like they expect you to carry, and I'm saying this not in a, I find this outrageous, but just it's something that's you have to know about, that they expect you to carry X amount of liability coverage. Like you have to have $100,000 and $300,000 per total incident. And so this is one of the less fun parts of being a debate coach, but knowing about those policies is important. And then equipment requirements will, not may, but they will apply to your personal vehicle if you're transporting students for a school activity. So to keep that in mind and just avoid doing it, because I mean, I would not want to do a pre-trip inspection on my car, and I don't think, especially not my last car, I would have flunked it, even if I was the one doing it. And then if you don't comply, the district's insurance carrier may say, hey, your person blew it, and so therefore our coverage does not apply here, in which case the district is uninsured for whatever bad thing happened, and then you will be the least popular person on the entire planet. Also, something bad happens, so that's bad too. But you want to ensure that whatever you're doing doesn't jeopardize the district's coverage, because that's just money that's not spent on kids in their classrooms.
Can I jump in too?
Mm-hmm.
So, folks with the Urban Debate League, you are covered under Augsburg's liability transportation. I think, as Meg says, it is best practice to not transport students, and we want to avoid it as much as we can, although I know that's not always 100% possible. If you need Metro Pass cards for your students, because you know you're getting back from a tournament and a student gets to home based on using mass transit, we can purchase Metro Transit tokens or passes for you to have as coaches to have on hand. In Minneapolis, of course, the students have the go-to pass, but I know that there are some limits to that too, and we have resources to help with that. So please just let me or Genesia at the office know if that's a need. And then for out-of-town tournaments, you know, as much as we can, try to hop on a group bus and do communication with folks who are traveling. That would be preferred. So.
Yeah, one of the stories, we talked about this last week that I heard that was sort of hair-raising, was students were done at a tournament, other students weren't, and so they said, can we just go home together? And coach said yes, and then come to find out that somebody didn't have permission to go, and also mom and dad didn't know where on God train earth that they were. And so that is totally avoidable by having a text from the parent saying this is okay. And that is also avoidable by saying, no, we're all here until we're done, and then we'll all leave together. So probably two different ways to handle that. Either one's fine, but the third option, which is knock yourself out, kids, see you next Monday, not my favorite option. And so, yeah, I would just keep that in mind. Now, last time I did this, there were lots of questions as we went through, and there aren't any yet tonight, so I'm kind of hoping that there are a great deal of questions now. So start asking questions, or I'll start calling on you individually. Yes?
Part of out-of-state travel is we go with, separate teams, but then, bringing out for dinner. requires probably separate transportation. What are the avenues that you think would be the best practice, like calling a taxi cab and piling all the students into a van and being with them? Is that like something they would do hedge against or ask for parent permission? Or?
Well, first I would say that some adult or complement of adults has to be with your group of students.
Right,
So
yeah, so I'd be with them.
Yeah.
It'd
So
be like 5 kids last year in Glenbrooks. We went into an Indian restaurant and we piled into a cab.
yeah, I think a cab is okay. I think a cab is fine. I think, I don't know about Uber, I'd be a little worried about that just because we really don't know what the liability picture
Sure.
is.
Yeah.
Whereas cabs are bonded.
Okay.
And so I think you have less of a problem with the district's liability insurance. And then and that's fine.
Okay.
Yes.
Could you speak a little bit more about pre-inspections for your vehicle and what like level our vehicle needs to be at?
No, because I don't want to do it. No, there's
But she said,
yeah, MnDOT has a checklist, and bus drivers have like your bus barn is going to have this checklist of what everything they have to do when they make sure that whatever's under the bus is
like
good.
the first aid kit.
Yeah, first aid.
Okay.
I've looked
And
into
then-
this.
And that your windshield wipers are working properly and that your blinkers are working properly, so that all the,
So, like,
the
basic-
peripheral, But it,
bodily fluids kit.
yeah, so I'm saying it's not, just don't avoid it if you can.
Yeah, just like in a situation like that.
Right.
You gotta make sure.
Yeah.
This is something that came up occasionally when I was a teacher, but like, so there's a friend of mine and her son like live next to, they're our neighbors, and he went to Central when I was teaching there, and I'd sometimes give him a ride home. Like I have some other kind of relationship. Like where's the boundary between, I mean, I guess maybe this goes with the boundary issues thing, but I was thinking about, like, does Sean's dad have to get permission or, inspect his vehicle to bring him home after tournaments, stuff like that.
Well, okay, I'm going to raise your narrative with another narrative and say when I was in high school, I had this great guidance counselor, and then one of my classmates who was a couple years ahead of me was just a miscreant and a ne'er-do-well, and his parents went on vacation and left him, which everybody knew was not a great idea, so he stayed with that counselor. Like he camped out at Mr. Grove's house. And what I would say is that was fine in the 90s, that was probably fine in the 80s, and nobody would have batted an eye in the 70s. And now, if you're going to do something like that, I would make sure that your principal knows and that a school counselor knows. If you have the permission of the school district, it's probably fine. But most of the time, that's not what happens. What happens is we have all these ad hoc conversations, and at first it's about debate, and then suddenly it's about all the mysteries of the universe, and now suddenly we're like making out in the backseat of the car. And so that is the problem. And I mean, I'm employed because that stuff happens. So it happens enough. The students who have larger concerns and they want to, bring the conversation to realms outside of what you're supposed to be talking about at debate practice. And I know that that's like a very normative statement that I'm making, and we need to be there for our students, but we also need to be directing them to the right people to handle their issues, and those are your school psychs, your school counselors, and your school social workers. Those are the folks who should be hearing concerns about the mysteries of the universe, and not related to domestic wiretapping. And and the ride thing, I totally get it, but you need to let your principal know, and they need to be the one to say okay.
So how many speeding tickets did you get?
It wasn't me.
It wasn't you?
No. It's 4 though, that's the question. That's too many. We share an insurance policy now that helps you narrow it down. Anything else? All right. If you have questions, you should ask Amy, you could ask me, and if I am not, if this is a Minneapolis question, you should ask my colleague Deb, who is actually much smarter than me as well. Sorry, people in St. Paul.
Yeah, so that concludes our training. I think just the takeaway is it's up to us to keep our kids safe, right? So if you see something, say something, and we have to be courageous and we have to make the right decisions, and we are students' advocates. that's really kind of the takeaway. So I'm always here as a resource. Travis is. We've got a wonderful advisory board that includes awesome people like Meg, and we're here to have a really great year. So thank you so much, Meg. Thank you.